The gun went off so close it didn't echo. It cracked. A single, dry thunderclap in a narrow Harlem hallway, the kind of sound that didn't travel far because it didn't need to. Everyone who mattered was already standing right there, close enough to smell the gunpowder, close enough to see the smoke curl lazy and gray in the air, close enough to understand that something permanent had just happened. Bumpy Johnson didn't fall. That was the part no one ever forgot. The man across from him, shaking, wide-eyed, breath stuck halfway between regret and survival, had fired from less than 6 feet away, point blank, no warning, no speech, just fear squeezing a trigger too fast for conscience to catch up. For half a second, the hallway went silent. Not shock, not confusion, silence, like respect being recalculated in real time. Bumpy Johnson looked down slowly, almost curiously at the spreading dark on his tailored coat. Then he lifted his eyes, and every calculation in Harlem changed. Because power wasn't just about who pulled the trigger. It was about who still stood afterward. Years earlier, before bullets and betrayals became punctuation marks in his story, Harlem already knew Bumpy Johnson as something different. Not just another street operator, not just another name whispered behind curtains. He was a man who understood systems, how they worked, how they broke, and how to bend them without snapping them too early. He moved through Harlem in the 1930s and 40s like a fixed point. The streets shifted around him. Politics changed. Police captains rotated in and out. Italian syndicates tested borders. But Bumpy stayed, tall, broad-shouldered, always composed. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. He read poetry in private and power in public. He could quote philosophers and still know which corner would turn ugly after sundown. Harlem at the time was a pressure cooker, overcrowded, underfunded, over-policed. Black residents lived under rules they didn't write, enforced by men who didn't respect them. White-owned businesses pulled money out. White mobsters pushed control in. And the police, they enforced order without justice. Into that imbalance stepped Bumpy Johnson, not as a savior, not as a revolutionary, but as a counterweight. He ran numbers. He controlled territory. He negotiated truces. And most importantly, he enforced a code. Harlem might have been dangerous, but under Bumpy's watch, it wasn't chaotic. Violence was measured. Disrespect was addressed. And betrayal? Betrayal was remembered. That reputation didn't come from stories. It came from consistency. If Bumpy gave his word, it held. If he drew a line, it stayed drawn. And if someone crossed him, it wasn't about revenge. It was about balance being restored. That's what made him powerful, and that's what made the point-blank shot so dangerous. The man who pulled the trigger wasn't a stranger. He was connected, known, a piece on the board that thought it could move without permission. In Harlem, that kind of mistake didn't happen by accident. Tension had been building for weeks. Small signs at first. Meetings canceled at the last minute. Money arriving light. Messages delivered with just a little too much edge. Bumpy noticed all of it. He always did. But he didn't react right away. Men like him understood timing. The shooter, cornered by his own fear and ambition, had convinced himself that Bumpy was just a man. Flesh, bone, vulnerable like anyone else. He told himself that one bullet could collapse an empire. What he didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson's power didn't live in his body. It lived in how people responded to him. So when the gun went off in that narrow hallway, a private space, chosen deliberately to avoid witnesses, to avoid complications, the shooter expected chaos, screams, collapse, a scramble for escape. Instead, he got eye contact. Bumpy didn't reach for a weapon, didn't shout, didn't stagger back. He stood there, steady, blood darkening his coat, breathing slow and controlled. The message wasn't spoken, but it landed heavy. You just made this bigger than you. Men in the room froze, not because they were afraid of the gun. They were afraid of what came next. Because Harlem had rules, and one of them was simple. If you failed to finish Bumpy Johnson, you better be ready to live with him afterward. Word of the shooting moved fast, but not wildly. It didn't need exaggeration. By nightfall, every serious player in Harlem knew two things. Bumpy Johnson had been shot at point-blank range, and he was still alive. Police patrols tightened, pretending concern. Rival operators paused deals, waiting to see which way the wind would shift. The Italian mob uptown, men who respected strength even when it didn't belong to them, took notice. Because survival wasn't the headline, response was. Bumpy was taken away quietly. No ambulance theatrics, no public scene. He didn't want panic. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted time. Time to heal. Time to think. And time, as always, was something Bumpy Johnson used better than anyone else. As Harlem exhaled, one question sat heavy on every corner and in every back room. What happens when the man who never gets disrespected survives the ultimate disrespect? The answer wouldn't come quickly, but when it did, it would redraw the map of power in Harlem, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a cold, deliberate shift that everyone would feel. Because the shot hadn't ended Bumpy Johnson's reign. It had clarified it. Bumpy Johnson recovered the way he did everything else, quietly, deliberately, and without asking for permission. There were no hospital corridors filled with police questions, no reporters waiting outside with notebooks and cheap theories. He was taken to a private place, tended to by a doctor who understood discretion as well as medicine. The bullet had torn flesh, but missed what mattered. Pain was real, but mortality had blinked first, and while his body healed, Harlem waited. In neighborhoods like his, silence was never empty. It was loaded. Men spoke in half sentences. Meetings happened without minutes. Everyone was watching everyone else, trying to read intention in posture, in tone, in who showed up and who didn't. Because power, after an incident like that, didn't disappear. It redistributed. Before the shooting, Bumpy Johnson's authority had been solid, respected, even feared, but it still lived inside understood boundaries. He was powerful because he was predictable, fair but unyielding, calm but not soft. After the shooting, that predictability cracked. No one knew what version of Bumpy would come back. Would he be cautious, weakened, angry? Would he strike fast and loud to reassert dominance or retreat into negotiation to avoid escalation? Those questions made men nervous, because uncertainty was more dangerous than violence. The man who pulled the trigger, his name didn't need repeating in public, but everyone knew it, went into hiding almost immediately. Not from the police, from the streets, from whispers, from his own reflection. He'd expected the shot to elevate him. Instead, it erased him. Every door closed quietly. Every message went unanswered. Even his allies kept their distance because association was now liability. In Harlem, survival depended on being on the right side of history, and history hadn't finished writing this chapter yet. The Italians uptown watched closely. They had always regarded Bumpy Johnson with a mixture of annoyance and admiration. He wasn't supposed to exist at their level, not on paper, not according to the old rules. But he did. And he held Harlem in a way none of them ever could, not through terror, but through alignment. They asked themselves a dangerous question. If someone could shoot Bumpy Johnson and live, what did that mean for everyone else? Meanwhile, the police made their move. They always did. A shooting like that gave them justification, not to solve the crime, but to apply pressure. Patrols doubled, raids increased. Men were stopped for standing too long on corners they'd owned for years. The message was clear. If the streets were going to shake, the law would shake them harder. But even in uniform, officers understood something had shifted. They weren't dealing with chaos. They were dealing with a pause before a verdict. Bumpy returned to Harlem 3 weeks later. No announcement, no procession, just a black car easing into familiar streets, tires whispering against pavement. He stepped out, dressed sharply, movement measured, eyes alert but unhurried. People noticed immediately. Shopkeepers looked up from behind counters. Men leaned back against brick walls, pretending not to stare. Conversations died mid-sentence, because he wasn't limping, he wasn't guarded, and he wasn't smiling. He walked like a man who had seen the bottom of the question and already chosen the answer. That first night back, Bumpy didn't call a meeting. That was deliberate. Instead, he went where he always went. The same clubs, the same back rooms, the same social spaces where power circulated quietly. He shook hands, exchanged nods, spoke politely, listened more than he talked, and every interaction carried weight. Men tried to read his mood, tried to catch a hint of what was coming, but Bumpy gave them nothing. No anger, no reassurance, just presence, which was worse, because when Bumpy Johnson was angry, you could prepare. When he was quiet, you could only wait. The rising tension reached its peak when a message finally arrived. Not from the shooter, from someone above him, a mediator, a man who thought in terms of percentages and consequences, someone who believed the situation could still be managed. The message was respectful, carefully worded. It acknowledged the incident without assigning blame. It suggested compensation, apology by proxy, a chance to smooth things over without further disruption. In another time, with another man, it might have worked. But the problem wasn't the bullet. It was the assumption behind it, that Bumpy Johnson could be negotiated with after being publicly tested, that his survival had somehow softened his position. Bumpy listened to the message in silence. He didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't ask questions. When it was finished, he took a moment, looked around the room, let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would be repeated later, retold with emphasis. Then he spoke, slow, even, final. "That shot wasn't business," he said. "It was disrespect." No raised voice, no threat, just definition. "And disrespect," he continued, "don't get negotiated, it gets corrected." The mediator swallowed. Everyone else stayed still, because correction in Bumpy Johnson's language didn't mean chaos. It meant consequence. That was the moment Harlem realized something crucial. The shooting hadn't weakened Bumpy Johnson, it had simplified him. The calculations were over. The patience had done its work. Whatever came next would not be impulsive. It would be exact. And somewhere, hiding behind locked doors and bad decisions, the man who fired the shot began to understand that survival wasn't the same as safety, because Bumpy Johnson was back, and the balance of power was about to be restored, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with a confrontation that would make everyone remember why some lines were never crossed. Harlem didn't sleep the same after Bumpy Johnson came back. The music still played. The dice still rolled. The numbers still got picked up on schedule. On the surface, everything moved like it always had. But underneath, something was tightening. Conversations ended quicker. Laughter didn't linger. Every man with ambition measured his steps twice, because Bumpy wasn't reacting. He was letting the city reveal itself, and Harlem always talked when it thought no one was listening. The man who had fired the shot had gone from player to problem overnight. His name stopped being spoken casually. When it did come up, it was followed by silence, the kind that tells you no one wants to be associated with what's coming next. He shifted locations constantly, slept in borrowed rooms, trusted men he'd once considered beneath him. Each move made him smaller. Each day eroded whatever authority he thought the bullet had bought him. That was the cruelty of it. The shot was supposed to make him big. Instead, it exposed him. Pressure began coming from all sides. His suppliers grew hesitant. His runners disappeared. Money dried up in places it used to flow easily. Men who once nodded respectfully now avoided eye contact. Harlem had judged him without needing a meeting, because Bumpy Johnson was still standing. And nothing challenged a man's decision-making like surviving the consequence he'd planned to avoid. Bumpy, meanwhile, moved deliberately. He met with elders first, men who remembered Harlem before syndicates, before big money, before the streets learned how to monetize desperation. They talked about stability, about how much blood the neighborhood could afford, about what kind of precedent this moment would set. Bumpy listened. Then he met with younger men, sharp, hungry, watching closely. They didn't ask questions. They wanted to see if the legend still matched the reputation. He didn't lecture them. He just told them, pay attention. Because the lesson wasn't going to be theoretical. The real challenge came when outside interests got impatient. Italian operators uptown began sending feelers, subtle at first, offers to help settle things. Suggestions that Harlem might benefit from shared oversight, shared enforcement, all phrased politely, all backed by the unspoken truth that violence was always cheaper for them than patience. To them, the shooting looked like opportunity. A destabilized king meant open ground. What they underestimated was Bumpy's understanding of timing. He didn't reject them outright. He didn't insult them. He listened, nodded, and let them speak themselves into overconfidence, because men who thought they were about to win always revealed too much. Police pressure increased again. Stops turned into detentions, detentions into charges, charges into warnings meant to be heard by the right people. The message was layered: control your house, or we'll burn it down pretending it was already on fire. Bumpy noticed something else, too. Some officers were nervous, not aggressive, nervous. They'd heard the stories. They knew what happened to men who tried to make examples of Bumpy Johnson and ended up becoming footnotes instead. They didn't want to be part of the next chapter. The challenge crystallized one night in a back room above a club that had seen too many eras pass through its doors. The shooter had sent another message. This one wasn't mediated. It was desperate. An offer to meet, face to face, neutral ground, no weapons, just talk. It was framed as courage. Harlem recognized it for what it was, fear looking for mercy. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He let the message sit for 3 days. Each day stretched the man's nerves thinner. Each hour fed the rumor mill. By the time Bumpy finally answered, the entire neighborhood already knew what the answer would be, even if they didn't know how it would unfold. The reply was short. Tell him to pick the place. That was all. No guarantees, no conditions, just consent. The chosen location was a narrow social club. Low ceiling, dim lights, walls soaked with decades of smoke and secrets. A place where voices carried and exits were limited. The shooter chose it because he thought it controlled the variables. What he didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson didn't fear confined spaces. He feared unfinished business. Word of the meeting spread without anyone officially spreading it. Men showed up early, pretending they had other reasons to be there. Drinks were poured slowly. Chairs were placed deliberately. Everyone understood they weren't there to intervene. They were there to witness, because Harlem ran on memory, and memory needed events. When Bumpy arrived, he came alone. No entourage, no visible protection. That choice spoke louder than any threat. He entered calmly, coat pressed, posture straight, eyes steady. The room adjusted around him. Conversations stopped. The air changed. The shooter was already there, seated, hands clasped tight enough to whiten his knuckles. He stood when Bumpy approached. A reflex, not a decision. Bumpy didn't acknowledge it. He took his seat across from him, close enough to remove the comfort of distance. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Bumpy broke the silence. "You shot me," he said, not accusing, just stating fact. The man nodded, swallowing hard. "I want to make it right," he said quickly. Too quickly. Bumpy studied him. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precedent, about what Harlem would become if this moment was mishandled. And everyone in that room felt it. The weight of the choice hanging between two men, one of whom had already proven that bullets didn't decide everything. The confrontation hadn't turned violent, not yet, but it had reached the point where words alone wouldn't be enough, because the challenge wasn't whether Bumpy Johnson could be shot, it was whether anyone would ever dare try again. The room felt smaller once the words were spoken. "You shot me," not shouted, not whispered, just placed on the table between them like an object neither man could pretend not to see. The shooter's mouth opened, then closed. He had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times, different apologies, different explanations, but none of them sounded strong enough once Bumpy Johnson was sitting across from him, alive, steady, unimpressed. "I panicked," the man finally said. "Things were getting tight. People were talking. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Bumpy said calmly. That was it. No insult, no raised voice, just correction. Around them, men leaned forward slightly. Glasses stopped mid-lift. Everyone understood this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a verdict being prepared. The shooter rushed ahead, words spilling out now. "I can pay, more than before. I can disappear if that's what you want. I just need to walk out of here." He said walk like it was still an option. Bumpy rested his hands on the table. He didn't interrupt. He let the man empty himself of excuses because desperation always revealed the truth better than pressure. When the shooter finally ran out of words, Bumpy spoke again. "You didn't miss," he said. "You just didn't finish." The room went still. "That means something," Bumpy continued, "because if you miss, that's chance. If you don't finish, that's intent without courage." The shooter flinched. "You wanted my position," Bumpy said. "You didn't want my responsibility." Silence. Men in the room nodded almost imperceptibly. They'd seen it before. Ambition that didn't understand weight. Bumpy leaned back slightly, creating just enough space to remind everyone that he was in control of distance too. "You know why I'm still here?" he asked. The shooter shook his head, barely. "Because this neighborhood don't run on fear alone," Bumpy said. "It runs on memory, and memory remembers who stands when they're tested." He paused. "You tested me." The shooter's voice cracked. "I didn't think you'd survive." Bumpy nodded once. "That's the only honest thing you've said." The words landed heavier than any threat. Bumpy glanced around the room, making eye contact with men who mattered. He wanted them to hear this part. "Harlem don't need chaos," he said. "It needs lines. You cross one, there's a price. Not because I enjoy it, but because if I don't collect, everybody else starts guessing." He looked back at the shooter. "And guessing gets people killed." The man across from him was crying now, quietly, ashamed, stripped of the bravado that had led him to pull a trigger weeks earlier. "What happens now?" he asked. The question wasn't just for him. It was for Harlem. Bumpy didn't answer right away. He stood. The movement alone tightened the room. Chairs creaked. A few men instinctively shifted their stance, prepared for violence that never came. Bumpy buttoned his coat carefully, deliberately covering the scar that would never quite fade. "This is what happens," he said. He reached into his inner pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. An address. "You go there tonight," Bumpy said, "alone." The shooter looked at the paper like it might explode. "What's there?" he asked. Bumpy's voice was even. "Accountability." No one in the room asked questions. They didn't need to. That address belonged to a man the shooter had crossed before, a small operator who'd lost territory, money, and standing because of deals made behind his back. Someone whose life had been destabilized quietly, without headlines. Bumpy hadn't forgotten. He never did. "You're going to walk in," Bumpy continued, "and you're going to explain what you did, who you did it for, and why." The shooter's breathing grew shallow. "And then?" he asked. Bumpy met his eyes. "And then you're going to accept whatever comes back at you. No running, no shortcuts, no bullets." The implication was clear. This wasn't mercy, it was balance. The shooter shook his head. "He'll kill me." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "Maybe," he said, "but it won't be chaos. It'll be contained, and Harlem will understand." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the shooter could hear. "You tried to change the rules with a gun. I'm reminding you who enforces them." The room exhaled collectively. This wasn't the bloodbath some had expected. It was worse. It was instructive. The shooter stood slowly, hands trembling, and folded the paper carefully before slipping it into his pocket. He didn't thank Bumpy. He couldn't. Gratitude didn't belong in a moment like this. He just nodded. Then he walked out. Bumpy remained standing. He turned to the men in the room, operators, lieutenants, observers, and let his gaze move across them deliberately. "No one touches him," he said. "What happens next happens because of what he did before, not because of me." That mattered, because it meant this wasn't revenge. It was justice. As Bumpy left the club, the night air felt different, lighter, not because things were resolved, but because the shape of resolution was clear now. By morning, Harlem would know. Not the details, not the address, just the outcome. And that was enough, because the message wasn't about death. It was about consequence. And consequence, when applied correctly, traveled faster than fear ever could. By sunrise, Harlem already felt it. Not the violence, there was none to hear, but the shift. The quiet kind. The kind that settles in before anyone can name it, but everyone adjusts to it instinctively. Men stood a little straighter. Conversations carried less bravado. Deals were spoken with more care, because the shooter didn't come back. Not running, not hiding, not bleeding into the streets. He was seen once more late that night, walking into the address Bumpy had given him. After that, he became something else, a lesson. The man he was sent to see didn't kill him. That mattered. Instead, he took everything, every corner the shooter controlled, every contact he relied on, every ounce of borrowed authority he'd accumulated. By dawn, the shooter was alive, but finished. No money, no protection, no future in Harlem's economy. He left the neighborhood that morning with a single suitcase and a reputation that would follow him wherever he went. In some ways, it was worse than dying, and everyone understood why Bumpy had chosen it, because death ends a problem, but consequence teaches. The Italians uptown took notice immediately. They'd been waiting for something louder, gunfire, retaliation, a show of force they could exploit. Instead, they got discipline, restraint, a power move that didn't require permission or apology. One of their senior men summed it up privately. He didn't just survive, he reorganized. From that moment on, their tone changed. Offers became requests. Suggestions became questions. They hadn't lost interest in Harlem, but they had lost the illusion that it was unstable. Bumpy Johnson had reminded them that his authority didn't depend on intimidation. It depended on inevitability. Police pressure eased, not because they approved, but because they understood. The streets had settled. No bodies, no headlines, no excuse for raids that would only expose their own lack of control. Officers still patrolled, still watched, but the edge was gone. Some of them, quietly, respected what they'd seen. A situation that could have exploded had been diffused without their involvement. That bothered them, but it also warned them. Within Harlem, the reaction was immediate and lasting. The elders approved. Stability had been preserved. The younger men absorbed the lesson without needing it explained. Power wasn't about noise. It was about follow-through. Bumpy didn't call a meeting to celebrate. He didn't make a speech. He just went back to work. And that, more than anything else, reinforced his position. Men who had been considering challenges reconsidered. Men who had been sitting on the fence chose sides. And those who had mistaken Bumpy's patience for weakness finally understood the difference between delay and hesitation. Because when Bumpy Johnson acted, he acted in a way that closed doors behind him. There were no second guesses. The scar from the bullet healed slowly. It remained visible, a thin reminder beneath tailored fabric. Bumpy never tried to hide it. He didn't display it either. It simply existed, a quiet testament to the fact that even legends could be tested, but more importantly, that they could answer. Months later, a young operator asked one of Bumpy's lieutenants a question he thought no one would hear. Why didn't he just kill him? The lieutenant didn't answer right away. Then he said, because killing him would have been about anger. This was about order. That explanation spread, and Harlem understood. The power dynamic had shifted. Before the shooting, Bumpy Johnson was respected. After it, he was recognized. There was a difference. Respect could be challenged. Recognition had consequences. The man who fired the shot faded into obscurity. He tried starting over in another city, under another name, but the weight followed him. People who'd heard the story didn't need details. They just knew he'd tried something he couldn't finish. And in a world built on reputation, that was fatal enough. Bumpy Johnson continued doing what he'd always done, managing territory, negotiating peace, enforcing lines. But something had hardened, subtly, not cruelty, precision. He had been reminded up close that survival wasn't guaranteed. So he made sure meaning was. Harlem moved forward. Children played in streets that hadn't heard gunfire. Businesses stayed open later. Money flowed steadier. The balance held. And everyone from the corner boys to the men in tailored suits uptown understood why. Because when a man survived a point-blank shot and responded with justice instead of chaos, he didn't just protect himself, he protected the structure. This wasn't the end of Bumpy Johnson's story, but it was a line in it that never blurred. The moment when power stopped being about reputation and became about record. And in Harlem, records were everything. Years later, when men talked about Bumpy Johnson in Harlem, they didn't start with the money. They didn't start with the territories or the deals or the quiet understandings he negotiated between forces that were supposed to destroy each other. They started with the moment he was tested and didn't blink. They started with the shot. Because every legend has a turning point, and that bullet marked the place where Bumpy Johnson stopped being a powerful man in Harlem and became one of its fixed truths. Before that night, Bumpy was respected because he was smart. After it, he was respected because he was inevitable. That difference mattered. In the years that followed, challenges became rarer, not because men were less ambitious, but because ambition had learned where it ended. Younger operators measured themselves against the story and came up short before they ever made a move. They didn't fear Bumpy. They feared becoming a lesson. The Italians never tried another direct play. They worked with Bumpy, not around him. Negotiations became cleaner. Agreements held longer. When disputes arose, they were brought to him instead of escalated past him. Even men who didn't like him acknowledged something important in private. He keeps things from getting sloppy. And in that world, sloppiness was death. Law enforcement adjusted too. Not officially, not on paper, but captains rotated officers away from Harlem who tried to provoke unnecessary confrontation. Paperwork disappeared. Certain investigations stalled. The message was never spoken aloud, but it was understood. Bumpy Johnson wasn't worth the mess, because when he moved, the city felt it, and when the city felt it, politicians started asking questions no one wanted to answer. Within the community, the story took on meaning beyond crime. Parents told it as a caution. Elders told it as proof that dignity could survive in a system designed to erase it. Young men heard it and understood something crucial. Power didn't come from chaos. It came from control. Bumpy never framed himself as a hero. He didn't need to. His actions spoke in a language Harlem understood better than speeches ever could. The scar remained. Sometimes late at night, someone close to him would notice him touch it absently, not in pain, but in reflection. A reminder of proximity. How close everything always was. Life, death, order, collapse. He didn't romanticize it. He respected it. Historians would later argue about the details. Who pulled the trigger? Why? What deals were really made? How much influence Bumpy truly held? But no one argued the outcome. After that night, Harlem stabilized. Not because violence disappeared, but because it became disciplined. And discipline was Bumpy Johnson's true legacy. He outlived men who thought they could replace him. He outlasted systems that tried to absorb him. And when his name was spoken, it carried a specific weight, not fear, not admiration, but acknowledgement. This man stood when tested. This man corrected disrespect without losing control. This man understood that leadership wasn't about domination. It was about responsibility. Long after the shooter faded into obscurity, long after the scars became stories instead of wounds, the lesson remained intact. You could challenge Bumpy Johnson, but you had to be prepared to live with the answer. Because in Harlem, legends weren't measured by how loudly they entered a room. They were measured by how the room behaved after they left. And after Bumpy Johnson survived that point-blank shot, the room never behaved the same again. This wasn't just about a bullet. It was about what happens when a man is tested at the closest possible distance, when death speaks first, and the response isn't chaos, isn't revenge, but control. Bumpy Johnson didn't become a legend because he survived a point-blank shot. He became a legend because of what he didn't do afterward. He didn't burn Harlem down to prove a point. He didn't chase fear to feel powerful. He didn't mistake emotion for authority. Instead, he reminded everyone, rivals, police, allies, and the neighborhood itself, that real power doesn't panic when challenged. It corrects. In a time when black communities were denied dignity by law and crushed by imbalance, Bumpy Johnson enforced something the system refused to give: respect with structure. Not perfect, not clean, but stable enough to survive. That moment, the smoke in the hallway, the silence afterward, the man who stayed standing, became more than a story. It became a warning etched into Harlem's memory. You could disrespect him, but you would live with the lesson. And sometimes that's the most lasting justice of all. Because legends aren't built by the shots fired at them. They're built by how the world changes after they answer. And after that night, Harlem never forgot who Bumpy Johnson was. Not because he couldn't be touched, but because when he was, he showed everyone what real authority looked like.